This is something that I'm quite curious about with beginners, both you yourself individually and more broadly, beginners of this day and age. Where do you go for inspiration? What do you go to?
I'm a music person, but this is a whole different discussion. This is an entirely different discussion.
Why? Why is it a different discussion?
Because then we can start talking about specific examples together.
This is a different episode, so, we haven't even set a topic yet.
That's correct. They're not supposed to know that, though. So we got to do the Men in Black wipe thing.
The closest thing I can get to is like, let's wipe that one and reset.
Let's lobotomize our viewers.
That's a bit more like Pi.
The film, or like I didn't know there was a lobotomy in Pi. Spoilers.
This is as good a place as any, I suppose.
What do you mean?
Starting with music, I had a student who we figured out that I guess inspirational trigger was weather.
Really? That's cool. How so?
She would struggle with I'm not sure how should like this, how should I cover it? And for whatever reason, we were talking about time of day, and time of day also, as far as lighting goes, really does include season and by extension weather. And that triggered something within her. And then from there on, it's like, not sure about this scene. Oh, but yeah, okay, what's the weather like? Oh, it's like a little gloomy, a little drizzly, but like kind of like not quite like a little bit of that. Yeah. So it's not to say that there is like a prescribed way of triggering the free association, the stream of consciousness. So music is as good as any.
Yeah, music is fantastic. It's personally my primary inspiration at the moment, like for most of my existence.
When you start a new idea, do you also make a playlist?
Yep, that's been a thing for 2 years. And it sometimes works, sometimes it doesn't. Like the playlist is normally quite small if I'm not fully feeling the idea. And if I'm really feeling the idea, the playlist will not only be big, but also it's the only thing I'll listen to.
I am going to put my amateur psychoanalyst hat on.
It's the same hat. He's always in this mood.
We were talking about blockages and reluctance before.
Yeah. Weren't we going to talk about art history today?
It feels like there is a resistance to talk about your music.
Why? I'm happy to talk about music. Happy to. More than happy to. I listen to really annoying music, so I am very inclined to not talk about it. Basically just Aphex Twin and like other electronic artists. I will talk about it then if you're so insistent upon doing it. And then I'll ask you what kind of music you listen to. We'll have a tit for tat though, because I'll ask you about your music or art or whatever. I haven't got a hat though. Anyway, I've noticed that one of the reasons I'm drawn to it specifically to Aphex Twin, whether or not you think he's a decent human being, which is not in the forefront of my mind at the moment, I really, really like the way that you can detect his approach to art and creation, like through his music, which is reflected in so many other electronic artists. Like there are so many other artists who basically act in the exact same way. I don't know if he's at the standard, but because of the flexibility of electronic music, it's probably just the way most of those artists are and why they gravitated to the genre. His willingness to experiment and complete what I at least perceive to be a complete disregard for what people want to listen to is what makes him so good. His more palatable stuff is the stuff that he says that he doesn't like, which is very easy for a lot of artists to say, I think. It's probably one of those defensive mechanisms where they're like, oh, I actually don't like that. It's just, too passe and like mainstream. But the fact that in the same album, you can have a compressed audio clip of his family singing Happy Birthday to him, like when he was a child, followed by a song that was created with prepared piano, which for those who don't know is when you alter the innards of a piano to make it sound and function differently, which he does all the time.
I can't remember the name, but there's a Swedish guy on YouTube who does all this like up his piano and then calling in either repair people or like piano teachers, replacing the hammers in the piano with actual carpenter's hammers and that kind of thing.
That's what Aphex Twin does. You'll have that, followed by a very traditional electronic poppy beat, probably characterized as with his really frenetic drum beats and the occasional attention deficit noise that you can tell he's making when he gets bored. He even said at one point his philosophy on making music was that he likes people to be a bit annoyed while they're listening to it. He thinks, I don't want you to fully relax when you listen to my music. I'm going to make you a tiny bit annoyed so you're paying attention to the way it sounds, which is an excellent way of thinking about that kind of thing. I don't think it's how I want to do things, but I really admire it. And that creative process not only generates music that I really like, but also resonates with the way that I want to make stuff. This may sound like hero worship, but allow me to continue. Also, there's no hero worship happening with Aphex Twin. That was one of the first times when I got really into an artist and then realized that the way that they made stuff kind of lined up with how I wanted to make stuff. Like, I wrote one of my short scripts, which, by the way, got an honorable mention at a really tiny film competition, script competition. I'm very happy. I'm chuffed. I wrote one of those thinking to myself, his music is the only thing in the playlist when I was writing it. After I wrote that short, which I wrote with the philosophy of, I'm just going to write an Ethan thing. I'm going to make it a decent story that has like a dramatic structure and a beginning, middle, and end and suspense. But the rest of it is going to be Ethan stuff. I'm not going to worry about genre. I'm not going to worry about tone, characterization. I'm just going to dump my brain into it. And I quite like it. I think it's a great script. I'm a big fan of it personally. Only after that did I start actually looking into how Aphex Twin made his music and realized how that was very, very similar. He only makes his little noises because that's what he wants to do, and he only makes them the way that he wants to make them. He said that the only reason he sells his music is so he has more time and money to make more music. Like, it's just such a creation for creation's sake, which I wish I could properly be a part of. There's definitely a bit of vanity to like mine. I think there's much vanity to his, but it was a really, really nice moment that probably put me more into his music when I realized that I had written something while listening to his music, unknowingly utilizing a very similar philosophy to how he made that music. That was really nice. And anecdote.
Interesting that. I think in the ways that for creatives, I wonder what our mood boards, what our playlists would look and sound like if you completely disconnected names of artists, took away any kind of possible knowledge of creation process.
After the accident of discovering that it was a very similar creative process, I then began to actively listen to more of his music, which was still really good for me, but it was much more of a, this is Aphex Twin, it will probably resonate me. It wasn't just the free association, this is making me think about something, this is being added to the well, you know? And in recent months, I've gravitated a bit further away from his music as I move on to like different projects, but I'm still in the same genre. I'm still definitely looking for similar music. I don't know if that's active, but I can guarantee you, if there was a playlist that I listened to which was no artist names and no song names, there'd be a lot more like mainstream dance music and pop there, because I 100% have a really annoying bias against any of it. And that is just pure, is it pretense or pretension for like the now?
There is definitely something to that. For artists in particular, the thesis antithesis pendulum is really at the heart of what we do, not just in terms of like where we are in Zeitgeist, but where we are in our development journey as artists. On the Fichtean dialect, it is the thesis antithesis of mainstream versus alternative, underground, counterculture, whatever you want to call it, whatever resonates with you. I mean, as I started kind of considering something creative as something that I might be able to pursue, it's very much if things were anti-mainstream, if they were
countercultural,
that was automatically something that drew my interest. Similarly, I'd like automatically reject anything of cultural expression if it had too much mainstream popularity behind it.
There's a perfectly reasonable, conscious thought process behind that, because like I want a unique voice, even though it's a good thing to pursue. I don't know how much it's limiting your voice.
I believe it is a natural process. There, I did it. I said the N word.
Don't just... Yeah, whatever.
As in, a way of defining yourself is by delineating yourself from where you came from.
Yeah.
At what age do we start thinking of ourselves as separate from our family, as separate entities to our upbringing, our local environment?
Adolescent, teen years, kind of.
Yeah, I think so. And I think also that's where we see from the people who are drawn to the arts is when they start rejecting mainstream.
That's the thing.
As a way of delineating themselves, like putting myself apart means I am me. I'm not just part of this other blob.
There is a really weird phenomenon I'd like to hear your thoughts on, at least like in my personal experience of that, because obviously I've had that whole process. I think I found countercultural stuff a bit later than most people would normally. I'm not a particularly angry person. It's hard to describe. Like, I don't really have much to disconnect myself from. I'm quite comfortable with the way that I exist. I'm quite comfortable with most people around me. And this is a other case for like a lot of people, is that the only thing that really puts them on edge is stuff that is outside of them, like the world and that kind of thing. So as you say, hypothetically, you grew up as a teenager who's really into the MCU and like all of these big IPs, and they're all big deals to take up all the headspace. As you gradually become more aware of the systems that are the reason those things exist, and like the things that motivate all of those pieces of media, even if that awareness is completely separate from those specific pieces of media, you'll turn away from them as they begin to represent something more distasteful for you, which is kind of the pendulum swing. Like it's a that's definitely what happened to me. However, a lot of the not mainstream stuff that I've returned to isn't stuff that I was disconnected from when I was very young. It's stuff that was hiding in my like preteen years, I've noticed in hindsight. I used to watch, when I was way too young, I used to watch a lot of David Firth. He's a British animator. He was like one of the first prominent mainstream Flash animators. He made a wonderful little show called Salad Fingers, which was the thing you would show people on the playground when you were 7 if you wanted to scare them. And I literally ate all of his shit up when I was maybe 10 through 12. A lot of it really messed me up. Most of it was not good for kids. And for most of my teenage years, which obviously ended really recently, I'm not like reminiscing like an old man. I'm only 20. But for like most of my time in high school, for example, because I only started listening to Aphex Twin maybe 2 or 3 years ago. For most of my time in high school, Aphex Twin was in my head the guy who was occasionally music for David Firth videos when I was 12. Every now and then he would show up and I'd like hear his music and I would be like, oh, that's interesting. And then suddenly 10 years after I'm introduced to him, returns straight into my life and I'm suddenly fully invested in this. And it's a really weird phenomenon. I can guarantee you there's like 6 other instances where that kind of thing has happened, you know?
Yeah, it's kind of interesting that like my parents were working class. None of them went to university, but it's only when I really started getting interested in art history that I realized that they had bought some pretty big reproductions of paintings that were significant works in art history, the pre-Raphaelite movement, kind of around about the time of Romanticism, significant painters. And these are just like everyday working class people. So yeah, like coming back and kind of like discovering pre-Raphaelite art and go, hang on, that's hanging in our living room. That
is such a great feeling.
Couch.
That's exactly how I felt when I listened, guys. I'm not as big an Aphex Twin fan to know what the names of his Selected Ambient Works Volume 2 songs are. For reference, Kim.
Yeah, I only know the name of one song, but then again, I'm terrible with song names.
How familiar are you with him? Obviously not very, only the name of one song. No. His second album has a deliberately obtuse naming system where you can only know the names of the songs if you have the album on vinyl and then assign them correctly to the numbers of the tracks, and it's really hard to do. And on Spotify, they didn't even bother. They just called 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. I think it's 2. I remember listening to 2 when I was 18 or 19 and thinking, shit, that's from I don't know, Spoilsbury Toast Boy, one of David Firth's cartoons that I watched when I was 12 or 11 and then lost a night of sleep over. It's such a strange feeling, you know?
Kind of funny, the root of our creativity, our aesthetic, I think goes back a lot further than most people usually think. Filmmakers tend to develop a lot later than other art forms, later in life.
Yeah. I mean, because it takes ages to develop technical knowledge. And as you're doing that, you're trying to develop, like not really. I think you can only properly develop if you have all the technical knowledge, and if you don't have all the technical knowledge, you're just developing a lot slower. If that makes sense.
I think also, you know, like that's the whole underlying premise of this podcast is like changing that. You know, like how we have been talking about music and how much earlier someone starts. Because musicians, the ones who reach the really, really high levels, you can quite comfortably say that they started getting serious about music, i.e. actually getting lessons and that kind of thing, somewhere in the age bracket of 6 to 8. And so I think in music, it's kind of easy to make the connection that whatever they were inspired by when they started picking up their instrument, it's going to have a huge influence of their style and development, right? Whereas for filmmakers, I think on the one hand, we probably pick up image-making devices earlier than we pick up, a musician would pick up an instrument, right?
Interesting, that, especially now, yeah.
Yeah. However, we tend to not get seriously thinking about actually making movies until maybe at the earliest, maybe if they're 12, 13. The majority, it doesn't happen until mid to late teens, and for some, it happens in their 20s. And I think there is a little tendency to kind of go like, yeah, like we're going to be so colored by whatever inspire us to pick up that instrument or pick up that movie camera. I believe there are a lot of formative plot points in the development of our aesthetic, and I think that kind of 6 to 10 age bracket is a lot more formative than us filmmakers kind of allow for, because we don't pick up the movie camera until much later. So we don't make that connection.
Do you have specific examples of what you think are the most formative plot points?
Like I said, ages 6 to 10. I think late teens.
The ages, yeah.
Late teens, as in actually moving out of home.
Well, that used to be the case.
So it's all about like that independence, right? What are the steps to developing your own individual, like your identity? And for me, I'm realizing more and more, I'm less and less influenced by what I see other practitioners do.
Yeah,
and I'm tracing my stylistic choices, my preferences, like back to that 6 to 10 age bracket.
I haven't been able to trace that at all. I probably don't remember enough of my 6 to 10 existence period to really know for sure. But I'm sure I'll have a few brainwaves at some point.
I think I have told you this, but like my whole idea about like the cinematic volume and space in terms of choosing lenses comes from Viewmaster. Yeah. So much of my lighting comes from Scandinavian Nordic twilights.
Well, okay. And I'm certain you didn't think you were going to be a cinematographer when you're 6 to 10. So a lot of it is...
When I started becoming serious about it, I was never, ever in my mind, those things.
Yeah.
What would Darius do? What would Janusz do? Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I'm glad that we're not kind of sitting here looking at just other movies as the primary point of departure, the primary point of inspiration. I'm a very strong believer that if you only ever look at other movies for inspiration, you're only ever going to look like other movies. And I do think also, to flog a dead horse, I think as an artist, it is really important to have at least an overview of general art history. And I feel like school systems are putting that lower and lower and lower down the priority list.
Yeah. Yeah, we should have this is a completely valid point, but I also think we should have a counter for how often this comes up. And it comes up a lot because it's very important and very true. I'm not trying to invalidate it by any means. Now that we've mined my primary musical inspiration and why it's so interesting to me, I would like to cash in a check and hear at least one of your primary either musical or artistic inspirations and why it resonates with you so much.
Paintings, artistic. I think you know one of them.
The Milk Lady. Is it the Milk Lady?
The Milkmaid.
Milkmaid.
By Johannes Vermeer.
And why is that, other than the lighting?
There are other aspects than lighting.
It's just the lighting.
I think it's one where I've realized that for me, I feel the energy of light scenarios.
Oh, okay. Is that the painting is kind of what...
Beyond just visually seeing it. I think it's the first time almost with a painting where I could really feel myself in that space.
Oh, okay.
So there is a certain spatiality. Is that even a word?
I don't know. It feels tangible.
The art periods that I'm drawn to are the ones that are more emotional or more about the feeling.
You mean abstract art specifically, or like just...
No.
Okay.
So Baroque and Romantic. Baroque, we're talking Caravaggio, for example. Technically, I suppose Vermeer painted in the same time, but it feels different to me. Romanticism is less about like realistic depiction and more of an emotional depiction. It kind of lies in the term of romantic and romanticizing itself. So we're not necessarily talking romantic love.
No, but like romanticizing something.
As in idealizing, putting on a pedestal, heightening and intensifying emotional aspects of a scene, scenario. So it's interesting that for me, both in music and visual art, I'm less drawn to, I should say, properly, neoclassicism, which is the time period kind of in between Baroque and Romanticism. Also runs along with, in general society, the Age of Enlightenment. So we're talking the time when, for example, Newton wrote his laws of physics, gravity, for example.
Right.
The invention of the steam engine, the very, very, very early days of the Industrial Revolution.
Right.
And something that you see with a lot of art and music in that time period is a distrust of emotion in music. Like when you think about it, It's the age of the steam engine. It's the age of like the laws of gravity. How much are you going to trust fickle things, unmeasurable things such as emotion?
Okay, what kind of music?
Mozart.
Oh.
Yeah, there is a sonata by Mozart that is claimed to be the most mathematically complex piece of music written. And supposedly, rumor has it that if you play it to babies in the womb,
Smarter, is that the one?
you measurably increase their IQ after they're born.
Right. Yeah.
That sounds like a urban legend to me.
Definitely. Without a doubt.
For me, both neoclassical music and art, I can appreciate, but I don't necessarily enjoy, if that makes sense. Not that I hate it.
This isn't your thing.
It doesn't connect to me like Baroque and Romantic music does. I think it's also interesting to note how much of our popular culture comes from Romanticism. This is a really interesting discovery that I hadn't really done until I started teaching. And that is putting together visual and music of the same zeitgeist and really see like how much they are expressing the same zeitgeist.
Okay. All right. I like the idea of...
When you play Baroque music, you show Baroque paintings, right? And then change it to neoclassicist music, and then suddenly the music and the visuals don't quite fit until you show the neoclassical paintings, and etc., etc., etc.
Do you have a contemporary example?
This 90s is probably the clearest. Grunge music.
With grunge visuals.
The bleach bypass look. Desaturated, grainy, dense blacks, a lot more grainy compared to the 80s, where a lot more high key visuals, like kind of pastels and candy colors. Probably the prime example of music to go with it would be something like the Bangles, like the real kind of poppy 80s pop. We are quite insular as an art form.
You think?
Up to a point, yes, compared to other art forms. I mean,
okay. I've always thought otherwise, but it's always been very surface level because I've always just thought it's a blend of image and sound and music, which I think inherently makes it not super insular, if that makes sense.
Yes, but no.
Okay.
That's what you'd probably think. But I kind of feel like other art forms are much more inspired by movies than the other way around.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Yeah. No, movies are always sort of like whenever you hear someone talking about movies, there's like a 70% chance that they're saying they've been inspired by another movie, not like a song or a painting or something. And normally, if something is inspired by a song or a painting, it's a very literal interpretation. Like it is an almost exact one-to-one recreation of it. Side note, Taylor Swift almost shut down You Didn't Know the entire podcast because I couldn't record one of her episodes last week because I was conscripted into buying tickets and it failed both times and it took up my entire day.
So music has conspired rather than inspired.
Exactly. Music has conspired to destroy us. So Taylor Swift, in case you didn't know, has taken to directing her own music videos. It's a pretty cool big leap that she's made. And because her songs are so narratively driven, they are so this happened, this happened, this happened, this happened. A lot of her videos are one-to-one literal interpretations of those events with the occasional abstract moment. They're getting more abstract, but still stuff like her song is called Lavender Haze. The video is going to have the color lavender in it a lot and maybe a literal lavender haze. And it's great. It's a good example of a lot of movies that are inspired by art and photography and music are less subtly inspired by it and more literally inspired by it.
Or it's like an adaptation.
Yeah. It's an adaptation, not inspiration. Yeah.
Yeah, so there's a lot of music that you could consider or has been described as cinematic, for example. And I think, interestingly, for a lot of filmmakers, if someone says such and such artist does cinematic music, very often the subconscious gut reaction is that, it's orchestral.
That's exactly what I was thinking. Yeah.
There are several subgenres of music, as like almost as if like we've made the music but never made the movie.
Right, yeah.
So to give you an example, like for me, in fact, that's a lot of where my current music listening is in that kind of space. I think you could probably say an example is Massive Attack.
Yeah.
That kind of in between pure electronica, but there's also some more traditional rock elements to it. And there's a definite narrative element to it.
Yeah.
If you do want to go down that route, there's a couple of other bands, Uncle and Archive. That's Uncle with a K, as in the old James Bond, the man from Uncle.
Yeah, they just give them a...
In fact, Uncle has a whole album, which as far as I can tell, is kind of that whole concept.
What's it called?
end. There's a 2-part CD.
Is it The Road?
No, it's called a limited release double CD back in the day. And one part of it is called End Titles for such and such.
I've got it open. I'll find it later.
Yeah. But yeah, that really does feel like end to end. There is a movie here. It's just no one's actually shot
It doesn't
the pictures
exist.
to it.
I love
Same as there's a school of what I think of as cinematic painters, right down to like painting lens aberrations and lens artifacts like bokeh, etc., etc.
Yes.
So there is a group that I feel kind of represents that, like what I jokingly call the Jeremies.
Why the Jeremies?
Because there are 4 of them called Jeremy.
Oh, that's a lot more straightforward than I thought it would be.
Yeah. Jeremy Lipking, Jeremy Geddes, Jeremy Mann, and Jeremy Miranda.
Wow. There's 2 Jeremy M's.
Jeremy Geddes in particular.
Oh, you've shown me this guy's stuff. Yeah.
I mean, tell me this doesn't feel like some fantastical movie.
Yeah, it does. I think it's also a bit of a sidebar. It's an art style that is the closest human equivalent to what AI art has started to look like.
Or the other way around. This predates.
I know it predates AI art, which is a very depressing thing to say, and hopefully Mr. Jeremy doesn't see this, but it definitely reminds me of. Oh wow. Yeah, I can see that.
Come on, my computer doesn't seem to like screen sharing via Zoom. Sorry, Zoom. I don't know. Anyway, you get the idea. I mean, we're not doing
the idea.
Moving images here. Again, something like, well, that explains it, doesn't it? Someone sees Jeremy Mann as a prompt for AI.
Everyone's been used as a prompt for AI. It's miserable.
But if you look at something like this, could you kind of, again, that's not an actual original, that's someone being inspired by, but could you see that as a kind of grungy color neo-noir?
See, my problem with art in terms of its ability to like, oh, wow, that's nice. Oh, wow.
So that's more whimsical and fantastical, more dreamlike.
Yeah.
And then the bokeh lens painter.
Oh.
Come on.
No, I see it.
Man, look at the bokeh.
That's awesome.
Like the reflection in the glass.
My issue with using paintings and art as inspiration is that I have too much of a bias for like very surreal stuff at the moment, and it doesn't quite. I'm less inspired by.
That there is at a certain point, art moved away from pictorialism and became a lot more abstract, metaphorical.
The quality of light, or the way that certain places feel and appear to me, is less important than. I'm really into Zdzislaw Beksinski at the moment.
Zdzisław.
Thank you. How's that pronounced?
Zdzisław.
One more time?
Zdzisław, I hope. I'm a lot closer than you are.
Definitely. I'm not going to try it.
I Googled it, like literally how to pronounce.
Do you know how to spell it? I certainly don't. His images are like a lot more of a, like, I don't know how to word it. It's not like a pictorial inspiration. Like, obviously there's not much happening there pictorially that I can take, like, that I can draw much inspiration from, but it might be kind of a creative process inspiration again, where he didn't title any of his work and it's just whatever he felt like making. It's very subconscious. It's very freaky, and I'm very drawn to freaky stuff. Can you try and figure out what draws me to this? Go, psychoanalyze me.
This is a lot more shootable than using. I'm wondering, so I hear the word freaky a lot, and I'm wondering if we can find connections with that. Just kind of see, can we find new avenues, parallel paths, slightly different paths, not to replace where you're stocking your well already, but to add to it, to branch out. That's a better word, branch out.
I was about to say I have no intention of replacing the stock of my well right now.
So I'm wondering how much of freaky is actual grotesque, how much of it is macabre.
I think so. I'm going to ask you to find them after I say what I think. I think I'm more into the grotesque than I am the macabre. And my assumption is that macabre refers more to like things that humans don't like, death, pain, suffering, whereas the grotesque is more of a visual perversion of things that we see in everyday life as a way of making them more horrible. horrible, but how would you define it so I can actually give you a proper answer?
I'm not 100% sure, actually. So this is something that we may need to look into a little bit more. But as far as I know, the etymology of grotesque is grotto or cave from Roman times, as in activities that would take place away from the light of day, would be hidden underground in caves, and you can only imagine what they were up to in those caves.
Something grotesque.
But literally, because it's happened in these caverns.
Yeah.
Necromancy, satanic rituals, and then later on that's kind of become more decadent with a kind of corporeal distortion side to it.
The way I differentiate the two mentally is that macabre is a lot of gothic horror, whereas grotesque brings like a bit more body horror or
hence the
cosmic horror. Yeah.
My understanding is that macabre, the etymology is to do with Jesus at the Golgotha, because macabre refers to Maccabees, as in the Judas Iscariot family line, I mean. So there is that death cult to it.
Yeah.
There's the dance of the Maccabees, which is kind of like the dance macabre, where you get like the skeletons dancing. I feel like there is that etymology to it, but I'm not 100% sure. If I'm hearing correctly, then it's more that kind of pushing the boundary of what is the body.
Yeah, and it's not even that. It's just pushing the boundary of what is palatable in terms of what can be seen and heard. And it doesn't necessarily mean people being mutilated, but also just like grotesque aesthetics, like things that don't blend particularly well. Strobe lights, loud noises, like things. Finally, I get to insert a piece of. Well, this is a great time for me to run out of battery, because I wanted to show you the piece of media for me comes to mind when I think of the word grotesque now. It is a very modern take on the grotesque. There is an absolutely spiffing game. It's a video game of all things out there called Cruelty Squad. And everything about it is grotesque, and not in a violent blood and guts way. I just share it with you. Hang on. You seen this?
Yep.
This is a video game, by the way. And the best thing about this is that it is an objectively good video game. It is a very, very well-made game with great mechanics that can be quite fun. And as it happens, has thematic depth, which I did not expect from something that looked like this. I thought it was a nihilistic shitpost, and I had a look at the artist who made it and his style, which is very reminiscent of this stuff. That's grotesque for me, and it's so interesting and so fascinating. It's on my mind all the time. You following?
That's the square with Sir Roger.
Huh? Not at all. What do you mean? How does it square with Sir Roger? I think it would probably it would give Sir Roger a pulmonary embolism and he'd die.
Yeah, no, I just find this fascinating how dissonant your reference points are.
Yeah. I'm only like 6 years old, mind you. I'm still trying to collate them into some kind of neat package.
Yeah, I think like the flippant part of me is my top of my head going, good luck with that.
Oh, there's no way that I'm ever going to be able to properly visually emulate Cruelty Squad. I don't know if that's possible. Again, I'm probably even more fascinated with the artistic intent and the method there, where someone deliberately made it look and sound as abrasive and horrible as possible, but for a purpose, which I love, you know? And also lets us figure out what is abrasive and what is horrible, and it's grotesque. Like, can you deny that that is grotesque to look at and to listen to?
Not sure grotesque is the word I would use.
Well, I think grotesque is the word that I would use.
I think for me, grotesque has a more ancient primal element to it. I think abrasive does describe it for me, certainly. Obnoxious, might be a word. Certainly not something that I would be able to consume for enjoyment myself. In terms of the dialectic pendulum swing, I did go through as kind of shock value phase myself.
And this is definitely the back end of that for me, which is something I'm fully aware of, but not unwilling to embrace.
Are you familiar with the performance artist Stellark?
No, I'm not.
Right, so this I may need to blur. We'll see. Sensitive audiences, blah, blah, blah.
Fair enough.
Again, that question of what is art? What can art be? Stellark did kind of cyborg extensions and modifications to his own body as performance art.
Well, I think I know this guy. I think I've heard of him. Yes, I do know this guy. It would probably be worth blurring for a couple of people, I think.
So yeah, I think that spiritually, I think in some ways comes from a similar zeitgeist, a similar place as
Cruelty Squad?
More so Aphex Twin.
Yeah, how so?
I think a lot of electronic music comes from the same zeitgeist as the like.
As in the what can I do zeitgeist, or?
Yeah, and also that kind of like where does the line between electronic and organic lie?
Oh, okay.
So a lot of the same cultural environments as something like this grew out of is also the same kind of cultural environments that something like Kraftwerk grew out of. And eventually from there, industrial music, which, initially for a lot of people just sounded like noise.
Yeah.
And literally was kind of machine noise sampled and reused and tweaked and modulated.
And the question is kind of how can we humanize those noises?
Yeah, and I think also, like if you take this a little bit back further, I think that stems back to Expressionism and 1920s, which also saw like a broader culturally existentialism. The question of why are we here, or like what purpose, like what does it mean to be a human?
When you mentioned that, like that sort of dissonance between the whole Roger Deakins as inspiration thing, as well as say Aphex Twin or Cruelty Squad or something, it's probably kind of exposes my difference in confidence when envisioning stuff to write or things like as a project wide level. The Roger Deakins stuff is exclusively like a formal, this person does this well, what can I draw from them? I like the way this stuff looks. It is still 100% a formal inspiration, whereas the inspiration I get from, say, Aphex Twin or Cruelty Squad is like much more of an artistic one. I'm not only just like at like a really innate level, like the stuff resonates with me, but like the philosophy that they've made the art with is very inspiring. I think there's a difference between like artistic and formal inspiration, if that makes sense. And I think it depends entirely on how confident I am in the area that I'm working in. So like with cinematography, I'm still looking at formal inspiration, whereas with writing and like stuff that I can just visualize conceptually with not much pressure, then it's a lot more personalized and artistic, if that makes sense.
I'm not sure I follow. I guess where I'm kind of struggling a bit to get on the bus is that for me, I don't necessarily see that difference for myself, if that makes sense. Can you elaborate a little bit more on what you mean by formal inspiration? I think that's like, where I've got a little bit of like, I'm unsure where that is going.
I say, I think that this such and such short should look like such and such Roger Deakins project. It's more because I think there's something I want to learn from his images to make it look that way. Whereas I don't feel compelled to learn anything from Aphex Twin or from Cruelty Squad. I don't really think there's much to learn at all. But like they're empowering in like an artistic way, if that makes sense. I'm not trying to learn anything from them. They just resonate with me.
Interesting. Yeah, I think for me, like, I'm not inclined to draw that division for myself, if that makes sense. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, the division probably exists exclusively because I don't have much confidence in, like, as much confidence in cinematography. So I feel like I'm more inclined to find things to learn instead of drawing inspiration from stuff, I'm also learning from it, if that makes sense. And then there's just more nebulous sort of like, this just makes me feel inspired and empowered. I'm not learning anything from it. I'm not really taking any lessons. I could emulate it, but it's not
Again, interesting. I'm not questioning you to change your mind.
No, I know. Yeah, I'm aware.
Be upfront about that. But yeah, for me, I don't see the difference, if that makes sense.
Because you're probably slightly more, you're a lot more confident artistically than I would be now, if that makes sense. There's a lot more dissonance. Like, I don't necessarily want everything that I shoot to look like something by Roger Deakins, for example. But I know that there's a lot to be learnt, so I'm going to allow myself to draw from it. Whereas I do sort of want the stuff that I make at the moment to be made with the same approach, the same philosophy as how Aphex Twin makes his music and how Cruelty Squad was made, but not directly learning from it. I am drawing Here we go. From Cruelty Squad and Aphex Twin, for example, I'm drawing only my own responses from it. I'm not looking up any specific techniques. They're not even in the art form that I want to approach. I am just drawing my own conclusions from the appearance and the sound of all of it, and maybe their artistic approach. And that's it. Those things already resonated with me when I found them.
Mm-hmm.
I was already feeling a similar way to them when I found them, which is why they resonate with me. Whereas, for example, with Roger Deakins, I look at someone who's doing this thing well and in a way that I like and think, how can I learn from that? I actively take things from it, objective truths, like their approach to it, technical specifications, like technical elements of it, I will draw out. It wasn't like wow, he and I have this really similar philosophy. It's just like, I think he does it very, very well, and I think there's a lot to be learned from it. And he also shot a lot of movies that were a similar tone to the stuff that I wanted to make. So I just thought it's only logical to just kind of keep his work around in my peripheral vision.
I'm wondering whether you are conflicting yourself, because in my way of seeing things, I feel like the artistic approach that you describe from things like Cruelty Squad and Aphex Twin, even if we aren't taking the direct visuals, even if we aren't taking direct techniques, the underpinning approach and philosophy seems to me to come from a place of experimentation, of coming up with an outcome that isn't the accepted norm. Whereas I feel like what you're doing with your cinematography is exactly the opposite. To me, it kind of feels like artistically you're fighting yourself.
Well, I don't think I have the creative toolkit for cinematography to warrant experimentation just yet, like proper large-scale experimentation. Personal experimentation, that's fine. But like, I think that in terms of the way that I develop stories in my head, I have enough knowledge to experiment safely and generate results that I like.
I'm wondering, though, whether that is the key word there, and whether you are actually blocking paths for yourself, whether you're actually self-sabotaging subconsciously. The key word that I latched onto there is safe.
Yeah.
If I understand your read correctly, none of either Cruelty Squad or Aphex Twin or any of those references operate from a place of safety.
Not initially, no. Yeah. But also they do. Sorry, that's hard to, yeah. God, they do, because they're pieces of art and people expect them to be experimental and different. So there's never going to be an overwhelming, wow, this shit sounds weird, how terrible, because that's how art works. That's how people expect art to work. But like, it's that really basic thing. It's that like you need to know the rules to break them. And I prefer to start building my foundation with cinematography before I start breaking any of the rules. And I feel as though I need to keep building my foundation for a bit longer.
I'm not sure about that, to be honest. In my opinion, in my observation, successful experimental artists have early on known that they want to challenge the existing ways of doing things. And it just, yeah. I mean, I think it's worth asking yourself, when is the time for you to challenge those notions?
I don't know.
I think a lot of these kinds of artists, most of them who are successful, have quite early on in their development been loud and proud about calling themselves experimental. I think it's worth asking yourself that question. Are you willing to call yourself an experimental artist?
That's the thing. I think I am in anywhere but cinematography. I don't think that I have any urge to change or challenge things for cinematography specifically.
To me, that feels like cognitive dissonance and chickening out.
Oh, okay, sure.
If so many other of your creative drives and creative inspirations are experimental, then why lock yourself in this conventional, for lack of a better word, cinematography box? Why not go all out? I guess that is a question too.
That's the thing. I don't feel like I have the tool because I don't know how to experiment with cinematography. I can't picture it, you know? It's not and I think that I'm resistant to it because experimental cinematography, in my opinion, is something that beginners are drawn to because it's like exciting and interesting, and it kind of gets in the way of the craft. And I think I'm trying to spend a lot of time focusing on the craft of like coverage and basic stuff. I can't really picture how to experiment in a way that I think is worthwhile.
How do you know until you try?
I don't know. But that's the thing. I don't know what experimenting is with cinematography. Different forms of movement? Flashing lights? Like, I don't know what's experimental.
First of all, I think maybe how much experimental film history are you familiar with?
Honestly, probably not much off the top of my head.
Might be worth starting there.
Yeah, it might be.
So if we go like the kind of the pioneers, the high points, the kind of these are the people must know, etc., etc., etc. We are talking Stan Brakhage.
Let me write all these guys down.
Stan Brakhage. Elements of Andy Warhol. So, for example, are you familiar with Andy Warhol's Empire State Building movie?
They're just like a really long video of the Empire State Building.
Yeah. Chris Marker, Sans Soleil, probably a good place to start. Maya Deren, that's more kind of dreamlike, subconscious. Measures of the Afternoon is definitely the most. Ooh, didn't know she was Ukrainian. Interesting. But yeah, can you see the circles there? She moved in, influenced by, for example, Marcel Duchamp. Maybe not so much directly filmmaking, but around the same time, photographer Man Ray. If you like that sort
Dada.
of...
I love Dada.
More sort of surrealist. There is a Finnish, I believe, photographer working through the 1970s. I think he's still active. Arno Minkinen.
I think our good friend, Polish man with Z name, what was his name again? Please pronounce it properly.
Zdzisław.
He started off with experimental photography as well.
Yeah, Michael Snow. Wavelength, it would probably be right up your alley.
Oh, okay.
I'm not going to give away any spoilers. I believe it's Michael Snow. Yeah.
Spoilers for...
Wavelength. Think for me, like the experimental film I'm drawn to is the ones that are asking questions, particularly about what is reality? How do we know what we know? By kind of breaking the relationships and of particularly relationships of causality as we know them.
Okay.
But I do find that very often, like the best experimental art, it's about the question, not necessarily about the answer.
Yeah.
But there needs to be a strong question, like a big question. It can be more or less intellectual. I probably prefer the type of experimental art where it's more visceral and more primal in terms of the questions they ask. But you know, like if you want to put the ultimate big intellectual question in art, the prime example is obviously Marcel Duchamp and the toilet ring.
Oh, it's the one that's it's a bubbler.
Yeah, as in, you know, is it art just because I put my name on it and I put it in an art gallery?
Same as the banana.
Yeah. I think another one, Doug Aiken. Unfortunately, I missed his Sydney exhibition. I do think there is still probably a certain stigma about being an experimental filmmaker. So I guess in terms of asking yourself that question, that is something to take into account.
Yeah.
A lot of experimental filmmaking has gone through a little bit of a mini crisis, maybe, in as much as a lot of what used to be the big question was about the physicality of the medium, i.e. if you look at Stan Brakhage, his thing was not using a camera, taking the film, scratching it, developing it, and see what came out.
Wow.
So messing with the actual physical media, which, you know, has gone away with digital. So a lot of that kind of experimentation that was done with the physical media and the presentation of the physical media is now done like in VFX and CGI.
Yeah.
I think the other one as well that a lot of experimental filmmakers kind of lost a little track of is the exhibition. How do we show the medium? Where do we show it?
Yeah.
Another really interesting part of Doug Aiken's work is that he does experiment a lot with the exhibition of his video work. His production might not actually be that unconventional, but if you look at something like his Sleepwalkers project, the actual video shot isn't that different. But if you see where it was displayed and how it was displayed in smack bang in the middle of New York, displayed huge on buildings, as in, do you get a certain Blade Runner vibe there?
Yeah.
Another one who's probably experimenting, asking more questions about place and time, Bill Viola.
I think, doesn't Chris Cunningham do some experimental stuff as well?
Yeah, his Flex installation. I mean, I've never actually seen it, but it is the whole...
Boy, I wonder who made the music for that.
I wonder. See, like I said, I only know a couple of handfuls of tracks by name, and that's because of Chris Cunningham. Yeah, Bill Viola's work here, much more about, I guess, the metaphysical nature of time and space. If you want like something that is a bit more conventional, are you familiar with the movies of Jim Jarmusch and Aki Kaurismäki?
Yeah, I know about Jim Jarmusch. I mean, I watched Dead Man. That's pretty much it.
Yeah,
but not the other guy.
Try some of his like older stuff. I think you'd probably, if you're not already, enjoy some of Tarkovsky's work.
I haven't watched any of it. It's a real point of shame.
Jodorowsky as well.
Jodorowsky?
Yeah.
That reminds me of that one book.
Uh-huh.
I have been meaning to watch The Holy Mountain. Is it?
Yeah, and El Topo.
El Topo, yeah.
Yeah, so I think a lot of these kind of experimental style within a kind of conventional boundary, I do feel like there were more of a space for them in the 1990s.
Yeah.
Late 80s, early 1990s. Interesting thing I find is that a lot of Jarmusch's work, Kaurismäki's work would probably be a lot more feasible now with the lower production cost.
Oh. With a cruel irony?
Yeah, because a high proportion of their budgets would be going into film stock cameras, processing, etc. If I was to pick one cinematographer who's kind of standing out as being representative of the 80s and 90s experimental, I guess when we say experimental film, I think we probably draw the distinction between experimental film installation art on the one hand, and experimental narrative film on the other hand.
Yeah.
So if you are looking for more traditional cinematography approaches, then Robbie Miller was probably the eponymous cinematographer for the late 1980s and 1990s experimental narrative film movement.
I recognize that name.
He's shot a fair few of Jim Jarmusch's movies, Paris, Texas, a couple of Lars von Trier. Lars von Trier, actually, I think you would like the Kingdom miniseries by Lars von Trier.
I've wanted to watch Kingdom for so long. Whenever I see it, I think, wow, this is just like so unique and so interesting and so grotesque.
What about the Twin Peaks original series?
You know what? I've wanted to watch that for ages, right? And you know where it's on Paramount Plus, and no one has Paramount Plus. It's a scam. I might get it on DVD or something.
That might be an easier avenue.
I really want to watch the new series as well. I've heard that the new series.
Yeah, I'm very, very skeptical.
Oh, really? Because I've heard that the new series is somehow more avant-garde than the first two. But I
mean, the Fire Walk With Me, much as I am a David Lynch fan, that is, that's just a little bit too incomprehensible for me.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
I've also heard that it has very similar themes, or at least approaches to death and grieving, as like one of my favorite movies ever, which is Lake Mungo. So I'm definitely excited to watch that at some point. But also Lake Mungo me up real bad. So I don't know if I'm ready for it. Who knows?
Eraserhead? You watched that yet?
I haven't. I'm going to be honest with you right now. What do you think the only David Lynch movie I've watched is?
I don't know.
Take a wild guess.
Don't know.
You got the first letter right, but not the rest of it. You can do it. I believe in you.
I don't follow.
Okay, It's his Alan Smithy movie. You can do it. Damn it! I feel attacked right now.
Pardon?
I feel attacked.
Yeah, I mean, if I'm hearing what I'm hearing, I mean, like it's like you have just like completely self-sabotage.
How so?
You not knowing David Lynch's back catalogue is just a criminal negligence. If I'm hearing your influences correctly.
Oh yeah, no, it's been another point of shame of mine for a while. But if I'm being perfectly honest, I don't really know where to start. That's the issue.
At the beginning, go chronologically. Very simple.
Really?
Yeah.
Huh. I
David
guess
Cronenberg?
I will. Oh yeah, I've watched Cronenberg. Yeah, I've seen Videodrome and I've seen The Fly. They're both excellent.
Crash?
No.
I feel like there is a spiritual track from surrealism, expressionism, Dadaism that's gone kind of on the side, weaving in and out. I guess it's what you call, like, generally speaking, avant-garde. But that term seems to have fallen out of the zeitgeist. As in, do any artists up and coming still call themselves avant-garde?
No.
That's, I'd be interested in exploring, like, when did that term fall out of fashion? Why did it fall out of fashion? I find this like really curious if we spin it back a whole 2 episodes ago, or 1 episode or whatever, that your inspiration seems to be so much experimental work, yet you find it difficult to experiment in your own work, as in your own cinematography. I find that to be a real kind of fascinating dissonance or dichotomy or whatever you want to call it.
It's also like I've noticed this myself as well, that a lot of the experimental stuff that I like isn't normally film. It's like either animation or music or art.
Is that because you haven't seen enough experimental film or haven't been exposed to enough of it? Or is just
maybe, but I've had this awareness of my preferences for so long that you'd assume I would have watched some experimental film by now. And I have, but I haven't like consumed it as voraciously as I would other stuff.
I guess on the one hand, there is that distinction in experimental art of what I guess you, on the one hand, call more avant-garde. That's the more like kind of experimental narrative. I guess you can kind of draw a distinction in terms of exhibition space.
Yeah.
So experimental in terms of like what actually would be shown at some point in a cinema, whether it's for an audience of 1 or 2, as opposed to what gets shown in an actual fine arts gallery.
Yeah.
There's a distinction there. So, for example, something like Bill Viola, you would see in an actual gallery space.
Yeah.
Because the physical space and layout of the space is part of the experiment, so to speak. Same with someone like Doug Atkin, whereas someone like early David Lynch, Jim Jarmusch, although a lot of them actually probably would have gone to the same art colleges as the more installation type experimental artists, as something that would be more conventionally exhibited.
I definitely have a preference for more of the avant-garde narrative stuff. And I'm beginning to become more aware of my preference for like conventional narrative things that weave experimental stuff in and not things that aren't wholly experimental.
In that case, I would probably start exploring like 1960s onwards. So some of those, Michael Snow, for example, around about the 1960s, late 1960s, early 1970s is kind of when Andy Warhol started gaining traction. David Lynch, we're talking mid-70s, late 70s, when it really started getting going. Jodorowsky, roughly the same time period. Tarkovsky, I want to say like early 70s. I think Solaris was 72. Kaurismäki, that's early 80s onwards, I want to say. Lars von Trier, mid to late 80s onwards. And if you want to cast these you're probably familiar with, but like Wim Wenders and what's the other crazy German?
It's not Werner, is it?
Yeah. So what is curious for me is if you're drawn to those styles conceptually, I find it really fascinating that you aren't drawn to them visually.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
I don't know. I don't know what's experimental about the way those movies are shot. That's the thing. The way I see it, there is so much rigid technical stuff here, like correctly exposing stuff, color. Like it's so hard to describe. Like in the end, the Holy Mountain and stuff is still a camera being pointed at a subject in either a wide, medium, or close up. You know, correctly exposed and with movement or no movement. I don't know what counts as experimentation in that way. You know, you look absolutely baffled.
Is that because your subconscious is telling you that? Have you really sat down and like reverse engineered and taken it apart with your like more advanced cinematography computing unit engaged?
I definitely will now.
Because I think like in particular, Robbie Miller has a very different approach.
Okay.
Early Chris Doyle work with Wong Kar-wai, very different visual approach. I think that might actually be worth a look at. Like Wong Kar-wai and Christopher Doyle. So starting with Days of Being Wild, Fallen Angels, Chungking Express, and Ashes of Time, and probably going as far forward as In the Mood for Love.
I've seen In the Mood for Love, and I know about Fallen Angels is more experimental visual style. As we're talking about this, I'm developing a slightly better visual idea of what you're talking about, which I guess is kind of the point.
Anyway, since we got the warning, do we want to try? I'm throwing you under the bus right now.
Don't ask me to summarize this. Well, we started off, talking about the inspiration well, not we dump into it. Then you asked me what music specifically inspired me. I ranted about Aphex Twin for a while, which was very fun. I asked you about your artistic preferences, at which point you mentioned this wonderful idea of essentially uniting the zeitgeists of music and art at any given time and really living in that era for a little bit, which I think is excellent.
I don't mind talking about, like, for example, my musical inspirations. I just find it a really difficult topic to approach because I probably have most divergent, cognitively dissonant, eclectic music taste of anyone I know.
Oh, everyone says that these days, potentially.
Sure.
I feel as though you're going to prove me wrong at some point. Anyway, and then if I'm perfectly honest, I can't fully remember or articulate what we spoke about for the past hour.
So I guess then the last hour's experiment was about consciousness and perception.
Yeah, exactly.
Of existence at all.
Yeah, spot on. Did it even happen? Who knows? Where even are we? Do I even exist right now? I'm not even a video. There's no video of me. Am I a disembodied voice? Is that all?
Well, I think that's an interesting one because something like Tron at the time was extremely experimental. Because I guess Tron was the Matrix 20 years before the Matrix.
Yeah, it's definitely the VFX equivalent.
But yeah, just that question of like, do electrons have consciousness or can we anthropomorphize code? So I guess there is a challenge coming up, which ties back to our preparedness versus ad-libbing episode.
Yeah.
About the notion of experimental filmmaking.
Should I be building my experimental film canon?
Yeah, I guess. I think you have probably been given some starting points.
Yeah, I have.
And I guess it's something that we can revisit. I think at a certain point, I guess it's a question as well, more longer term. Are you going to declare yourself an experimental filmmaker? I think that is a question for you to sort out.
I just don't know.
There? Do you exist?
No.
I think also this is something to ask more broadly amongst your either film buff, film interested, as well as filmmaker friends. What's the awareness? What's the interest level in experimental film?
Yeah, I think it's not huge among my friends, but I'm not sure.
It used to be such a big part of film schools. Yeah, it used to also be like a big part of the film buff, the film nerd community and experience. Alrighty, we're going to call it there?
Yeah, can't think of anything else to summarize or say. Definitely I'm all talked out personally.
Wow.
Yeah. I know.
Well, I guess we got a result from that experience.
I suppose we did.
Experiment. I mean, it is actually possible to shut even up.
Maybe. All talked out for the next 10 minutes, more like. Maybe. Who knows?
Well, I'm going to shut you up literally because it's now 1 minute past 5 when you actually wanted to stop